welcome back to the Brandon and Joe podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Kern. Received his PhD in IO psychology from Baruch College and is currently a director of global HR advisor at Citi. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining
Welcome.
us today.
Thank you both for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, the last time we all got to chat was at SIOP. I feel like we start like most of our episodes out like that. Oh, the last time we chatted was SIOP.
Yeah, it usually involves some reception and some adult beverages, I've noticed. So,
There's nothing better. Um, that was have you been to a lot of SIOPs before? Was that your
no,
first
I've been
one?
to a lot. So, I don't even know which one this has been. I took a break for a couple of years. Just travel was difficult, etc. But yeah, I've been to well over 10 for sure.
Yeah, we love it. Honestly, we're joking about how every episode could be started off with like PSYOP or Metro. But also it's like we could thank so many of our episodes just for like going and grabbing a drink with somebody at one of those events. So I feel like it's kind of cool to see that people appreciate and go to events like that are in our industry because it really helps like everybody network and grow. Like it's something that's really cool.
Yeah, I agree. As I've progressed in my career, sometimes the networking and the meeting folks is almost equally as important as going to the sessions and learning about what's being done new and interesting in the field, for sure. Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, you what's the right, not proctored an event. You spoke at one of the
I
events,
did.
right?
Yeah. I had a career panel for careers in IO that I was participating in last site. So
Wow. We Joe and we've talked about this on here. We had Vivian Wu on the podcast talking about PSYOP, but like just to give our listeners an idea, like how did you get involved in like doing a career panel at PSYOP?
Actually, I gave a career talk to the IO students at Baruch. Um, and it really, there were some great questions. And I felt, fortunately and unfortunately, I'm at the stage in my career where I've had enough experience that I can help to give back to folks that are just starting theirs, which is a great feeling, but also means that I'm getting older, which is not such a great feeling. But there's so many different directions you can go in IO psychology, and there's always, I know, hunger for people to understand what those directions are and if there's any secret sauce, right, that they should know about. And so, luckily, my network was large enough where I could call on some folks that could give that diversified experience. So it was a lot of fun.
And you have some great experience. I mean, starting at Northwell and now being at Citi, two like I guess vastly different businesses, but like huge businesses in their respective area. Um, was that a difficult transition going from like a healthcare to like a financial industry services? Or was there like overlapping themes?
Yeah, definitely different. There's some overlap, right? I think Citi culturally is our CEO says it's a bank with a heart, right? And you feel that in the culture. So and obviously healthcare has a heart, right? So that type of transition was easy. People are kind and friendly, same in the healthcare system. So that was kind of nice. What was different is the bank is massive, well over 200,000 employees spread across the globe, all different types of businesses and services that I wasn't familiar with, um, and lots of acronyms. Um, so I think understanding the culture there and understanding the business of banking was probably one that had a longer runway, right? But overall, the transition wasn't too difficult at this point.
Just wondering, like, do you have any tips or tricks for when you started at Citi that kind of helped you acclimate and like learn about the business?
Sure. I think this probably just relevant for any time you transition, right? It's not necessarily specific to transitioning to finance. Do a lot of listening, ask really good questions. I think as IO psychologists, one of the skills that we've learned in all of our studies and all of our work is how to ask questions, right? And ask good questions to understand. People, I found in my career, people are really engaged and want to help you if you ask questions and show a vested interest in understanding what they do for a living, right? By understanding that, you can figure out then how to apply your skill set and support them. So, doing a lot of listening, less talking when you start. The other thing I'll say is if ever I've been asked in my career to come in a place and make change from day one, I've not taken those jobs because I don't think that those jobs are ones that somebody can be successful in, uh, relatively speaking. So, yeah, I would say those are probably the two key areas. And then start to build relationships. And how do you do that? You take people out for coffee, you schedule meet and greets, um, and and you just learn. Approach from a learning mindset. That's how I've always done it, and it's been helpful for me to approach it.
I like that listening piece. I think it's super important, especially in terms of networking, like actually going into whether you have like a meeting or a call, like if you're for example, if you're like an aspiring student going to talk to someone who's been in their role for 20 years, not just going in and being like, oh, where's the job? But like going in there and being like, oh, so like, what does your day to day look like? And then learning, and you can kind of keep that relationship with them. And then maybe if something pops up in the end, but it's more just understanding what the actual job entails. Cause like you might not really know what it means to be a consultant. And then you get the job and you're like, all right, what do I actually have to do? Now I'm here. So you're right. It's a key part in that relationship building piece of it.
Yeah, it's like a longer term approach, right? So it's an
Yeah.
investment that will pay dividends in the long run. You just have to be around and patient enough to see those dividends pay off.
When you were networking, did you go to like certain events, or were you more talking like when you're actually in the company doing those like coffee chats, like, oh, someone from accounting and then someone from logistics?
Yeah, so in the organization, I took an active role in trying to pick out those people, right, where I needed to learn more and build those relationships. And that was dependent on the role I was in, the projects I was working on, the people that I was going to interact with to start to build those. And that network becomes great because as you build those relationships, you're able to leverage that for feedback on the projects you're working on, right? Sometimes you have, especially when you're new, blind spots, right? And so you can call upon those people to say, hey, as a business owner, right, how does this initiative or this plan affect your business and how will it land, and get that feedback, which I think is great. When I've been searching for jobs, it's been a little bit different to answer the other part of your question, Joe. And that's I've leveraged just the network that I've built of IO psychologists. I've been really lucky having done my studies and lived in New York for my life. There's plenty of us folks around, um, and so I put my feelers out when I'm ready, and usually things pop up. And since I've been around for a little bit of time, a lot of the jobs that I've received or been lucky enough to get have been because I've leveraged that network and had those opportunities. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in a previous episode Joe and I had with Tristan Baharali, we spoke about the idea of like a strategic network around the organization, and especially when you're in HR, like, and you support the business in HR, it's even more important to like have the partners around the organization that can help you, or you can lean on them, I guess is a better way to put it, when you need to.
Mhm.
Um, and you're in HR over at Citi, so I'm going to use that to transition to talking about your work at Citi. Would you kind of be able to walk us through what a day in the life looks like for you, like what to expect?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wasn't hired into this role, but I've been in this role now for almost a year at Citi. So I'm an HR advisor, HR business partner. Um, and I guess the first thing is with any of those types of roles, your day to day doesn't never looks the same. So best laid plans, you have a list of things you want to accomplish, and that all goes out the window the moment you walk in the door or take your first Zoom call. But typically, I have a number of buckets that I'm gonna sort of work in throughout throughout the days. The first is I I have a number of strategic or advisory items that I'm working on with my clients. So the clients that I support have close to 6,000 employees across the globe and across the firm. So there's a number of different strategic initiatives that we're working on around designing the organization, making sure that the work is flowing appropriately. At times in for-profit businesses, especially, you're divesting businesses that you own, right? And so we're thinking long term about that. We're thinking about how to strategically harness technology like AI and machine learning to help do business better in the space that I'm working in as well. And so I'm meeting with those senior leaders to talk about the people side of those initiatives and being their advisor. I spend a good amount of time coaching senior leaders. So even though I'm not in the formal talent management space, I do spend a lot of time doing that, coaching and prepping them for town halls, for important meetings, how they're having conversations with their employees. Um, I definitely do some leadership development as part of my role as well. I'm in lots of meetings, so my day is filled with meetings, in person and in Zoom as well. I don't have any direct reports in this role, which has been the first time in a very long time in my career. However, I do have a team of HR business partners that help support my clients. And so while they're not directly reporting to me, I work with them as if they are my direct reports. So I still have talent conversations with them, grow them, give them feedback. I just don't have to deal with the administrivia related to being a leader, right? So I don't write performance reviews, but I contribute to them. I don't have to deal with year-end comp and things like that. And then I also have some pet projects that I'm working on. So I always like to, as I get embedded in a role, look for a project that's going to engage me, right? And help leverage the things that I like to do. And so I try to dedicate some time at least each week to those projects that are much longer term. And then I have some extracurricular activities too, like I'm a dissertation advisor for a friend of mine in who's getting his EDD.
Sounds like your plate's full.
Yeah,
I don't envy it.
that's just work, right? I also have a family and all that other stuff, but
It definitely must be tough to balance. Um, and when you were discussing with us, I guess at SIOP, the actual division you work in, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's risk management or risk compliance?
it's independent compliance risk management. Yeah,
Ah, okay.
compliance.
Mix those words around,
Yeah,
I'll get
yeah.
there. Which sounds super interesting. And when you were telling us about it, uh, is that a area of the business where you really had to learn and study? Because I can't really imagine that you just come in with that sort of knowledge into any type of role.
Yeah, it's a great question. You're absolutely right. So even in my previous role at Citi, where I was designing how to promote folks at the most senior level of the firm, right? Um, Obviously, I was aware that ICRM, independent compliance risk management, existed, and it's part of what we call our second line of defense. So they're checking what are certain things that are going on in the business, right? The people that interface and do business for the bank, and they're an independent control function, we call it. But I had no idea the depth which with which they existed in the firm, right? And the three groups within ICRM that I support are anti-money laundering, sanctions, and fair lending and data privacy. And it's really interesting because anti-money laundering focuses on making sure that bad people don't use our bank to launder their bad money, right? And that could be so every time the bank prevents a transaction by somebody who's trying to do this, this has real life positive implications, right? It prevents things like human trafficking. It prevents people who are dealing in narcotics and drugs. Right now, money laundering around fentanyl is really big in the banking world, and we have a really robust program for detecting things like that in the firm. And so we have a huge program at the bank over 4,000 employees that are dedicated to anti-money laundering. And then we have our sanctions group. Our sanctions group makes sure that when countries impose sanctions on other countries, that money from those countries does not get into the bank. And if it does, those assets are frozen until that money is cleared to make sure that that money is not coming from those countries that have sanctions imposed on them. So it's really important, right? And that's ever changing, right? With the Russia-Ukraine war, sanctions were put on Russia, and the bank has to now make sure that money is not coming from those countries, right, into the bank. So really interesting stuff that I wasn't aware of. And then the Fair Lending and Data Privacy Group is really making sure that our bank lends money to people in a consistent way, regardless of their race, color, religion, national origin, and age, right? Which is a really great work. And other banks have been, I guess, in trouble or at risk of lending in non-consistent ways, and Citi has this group to focus on that. And then, as you can imagine, as a global bank, right? And if anybody wants to move money throughout the world, many folks are going to choose Citi to do that because we reach across 95 different countries. There's lots of data, and we have to make sure that that data is protected. And each country and cluster and region has different data privacy rules. And so this group in compliance data privacy is really making sure that the bank is compliant with those rules and not at risk. And overall, all of these groups are making sure that the bank is compliant for the right reasons, but also not getting in any trouble or hot water with our regulators that regulate the banking industry. And there are different regulators all across the world. So for me, it's fascinating, right? Because I had no idea that the bank was doing this. And certainly, right, as a consumer, you don't think all this stuff is going on, right? The only thing I had experience with was when I was lucky enough to buy my first house and applied for a mortgage. There were like 100 different things I had to fill out. Well, those 100 different things are getting checked to make sure that the money you have in your bank account is not coming from a source that's a bad source. So it's been a really cool learning experience.
That is so cool. I think the extent of my knowledge on money laundering comes from Ozark, and that's about it. So so I'm sure you've probably been interested in stuff like that as you've been working in this role.
Totally.
Uh, it's just to make sure, like for our listeners and for us to understand, like you mentioned clients, then you talk about the areas of the business you support. So are you kind of like an internal and client facing role? Like, do you kind of wear both hats, or how does that look for you?
It's a really good question, and so I'll provide clarity. For me, my clients are internal, so I
Okay.
support the senior leaders that run anti-money laundering, sanctions, and fair lending and data privacy. So each of those senior leadership teams, I directly work with. So those are my clients, right?
Gotcha. Okay, so that makes sense. So then when you're saying like you're working like you're almost like an internal consultant for the organization in this like HR sphere.
That's exactly right. And our work as advisors is that more strategic, future focused work. Look, there's tactical work in any job you do, but the goal of this role is to be that human resources strategic advisor for those senior leaders.
That is really cool. I feel like, it's so cool when we like get into a conversation like this because like you're speaking about things that Joe and I definitely need to grow our knowledge on, and I'm sure our listeners do too. But the fact is we all start from the same base, which is IO psychology. So it's so unique of like a field to be able to like have the knowledge that you get in grad school, and then you're doing work like this where
Right.
you're talking about money laundering and diverse practices and getting loans, and like it's completely different than what you would expect the reach of the role. One question I have for you, just like when we're kind of talking about that, like did you have like an expectation when you were like getting your degree that this was where you would take it, or is it kind of just like you took whatever came in front of you?
So no, I definitely have evolved, right? When I was in graduate school, I was mostly passionate about the I side of IO psychology. I liked that there were more definitive answers to be figured out on that side, right? Um, it was more mathematical, right? And then throughout my career, I started to get more involved in the O side, right, of this. And what I learned too, going through this and working in centers of excellence, was that we have to work through other people as we do our work, right? Whether that's leading the engagement survey, leading talent management, et cetera. And I was always interested in learning what it was like to be on the other side, because we leverage the HR advisors and business partners to do our work as experts or specialists. And so this is the second time in my career that I've made this transition. And it's the most difficult transition, for a number of reasons, but it's also the most eye opening, because you really learn what it's like to be the receiver of the specialist work and operate in the business with that. It's challenging, but you learn so much by doing it.
I'm wondering about like a broader sense, going into the financial services industry. I know we've talked a little bit about on the podcast. We have some people in IO that are interested in like finance. Um, what was one way that you quote unquote, broke into like a finance field using your IO knowledge?
Yeah. Well, the first thing was I had to have realistic expectations. So I made a lateral transition over to Citi, right? And part of that was because I didn't have any financial services experience. And although the role I applied for would have been a promotion, they were willing to give it to me as a lateral without that experience. So I had realistic expectations to say I can learn and build in financial service laterally and apply my craft, right? So that's the first part. I think the other part was I was lucky enough. This was to leverage my network. I have somebody from my PhD cohort. There were only 5 of us who works at Citi, and a former leader of mine who worked at Citi. And when I was ready, I saw an opportunity there, and I reached out to them to learn more. And I learned about the culture, and I knew that these are two people I respect. And if they're enjoying the organization, this was an organization for me. And so they helped me, right, to at least get in front of the group. But without them, it would have just been a typical process, Joe. Uh, application and move through. I don't think there was any secret way to crack it.
That's a really eye-opening conversation too, because I feel like I know Joe and I are recent graduates, and speaking to people who are kind of going through that process, sometimes it can be a little tricky, and especially right now in the world, like the network is so important, and like it's who you know, but also like how you build those relationships. Like you mentioned that it was somebody in your PhD cohort. Like Joe and I have talked about this before, but the idea of the work that you do while you're in the program is representative of the work you're going to do when you get out into the field. So like you want to make sure you're putting your best foot forward when you're in your program. Was that something that you kind of saw? You're like, this is someone from my PhD cohort. I worked with them. I know how they work, and like this is a role that I see them in. Like I want to be with that person in that like industry or in that area.
That's exactly right, Brendan. I couldn't agree more. So w- when you're able to leverage those networks and see people that you respect and like doing the work that you want to do, uh, that certainly makes things easier in making that decision. Yeah, great.
And it makes sense too when you're doing like group projects in school, and if you're working with that person, the way they act, the way they behave, the way their work's doing, you want to put your best foot forward. Um, so yeah, it's a good point, Brandon.
Yeah,
Um, I want to ask you as we near the end of our episode, um, one of our famous last questions. Uh, for our prospective students that are listening to this podcast, do you have pieces of advice as they enter the workforce, what they can do best practice wise?
sure. Um, uh, I said it a little bit earlier, which is approach everything with a learning mindset, right? So early on in your career, um, take the opportunities that are given to you. Don't worry about whether it's a right or wrong opportunity. Take it and learn from it. I had a professor in graduate school who talked about examples and non-examples. There's learning in both of those, right? So the non-examples may be painful when you go through them, right? Working for a bad leader, for example, but there's learning in there. So think about what you want to do and start to just go down that path and see if you like it. I think about it like an adaptive test, right? Where an adaptive test gives you an easy question and a hard question, and then it starts to zone into, right, what's the right level that you have on that construct. The same, I think, can be applied to careers as well. Take lots of opportunities, learn what you like. You might not see it right away, but those things will come together in your career at some point. I've had those epiphanies and those things happen to me. It's pretty awesome when it does, but take those opportunities and learn from them and then dial it in. And then the last thing I'll say too, I know you only asked me for one piece of advice, but I'll give you two
We'll
of
take them
both.
all.
Yeah, we'll take all of them.
Is if there aren't opportunities, create them. And I know that sounds like a little like, impossible. What do I mean by that? So if you're looking to do selection testing, you're looking to create surveys, let's say, or training programs, think about ways that you could do that even in a less formal way. So I was a volunteer fireman and emergency medical technician for just over 10 years of my life. And when I was learning about designing training programs, I designed an emergency vehicle operators course and ambulance operations 101 training for the fire department. It was less risky, right? They needed the help. They didn't have the budget. When I worked as a bartender in graduate school, I built a survey and a test for bartenders to be hired on the job, and it just gives you an opportunity to start to build that muscle. A lot of IO skills are like a trade. You have to not only learn what's in the textbook, but learn how to do them, right? And the more you start to build that muscle, the easier it will become for you.
Well, you heard it here on the podcast first. Life is like an adaptive test. We're gonna coin that phrase for you, Mike.
Bumper
But
stickers and T-shirts to follow.
we'll we'll see. We'll take all the proceeds. We'll donate them to Citi. But no, it's
Yeah,
awesome
that's
though.
fun.
It's awesome though to hear like your advice there, and I think that there's a lot of great things that you said. It is true though about like life being an adaptive test is that you really want to try out what's best for you in order to figure it out, and from there you can really take the path that works best, but you won't know unless you try. And so I feel like that's like what you're saying in that. And then also on top of that, the greatest thing about IO is that we kind of already hit on this, but it can be applied to so many different industries and disciplines. So like the fact that you were able to do it while bartending or do it while firefighting is like all like a good example of like being able to leverage those skills. And if you don't necessarily have the first IO role that you want, because you can try and do it in another way. So just because like maybe the job market's a little tough now doesn't mean that you can't take a role and apply the learnings that you've gotten post grad school. So I think that, Mike, you hit on a lot of really great topics there.
Thank you. I agree. And it ties back to Joe's previous question around cracking into the financial industry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you don't have experience in that field, as an IO psychologist, you have the skill set to be able to learn about that. And that's something that you should showcase when you're being interviewed for that, right? I understand how to ask questions, right? And how to do a job analysis and break down a job and understand what people do and then apply my craft to that. It doesn't matter whether it's, you know, the NFL or financial services or firefighting. We as IO psychologists have the skill set to be able to understand that business in a way that we can apply our skill to it. So you have to sort of sell that to the folks that you're interviewing with so they understand.
Yeah, that's perfectly put. Um, Thank you, Mike, for joining us on today's episode. We had a great time. I'm excited for people to listen.
Same here, guys. Thanks so much for the honor.
Another one down, Joe. That was really cool. I know I feel like we just hit the tip of the iceberg on like half of the topics with Mike. Like hearing about the work he does as an IO psychologist is so cool because he gets to do so many interesting IO topics while also like diving into some really cool parts of the business.
Yeah, it was. I don't think we've had that type of work on before. Like, yeah, financial services, but like that in depth of like anti-money laundering, risk management, taking the IO piece of that was definitely interesting. I we have to follow up and learn a bit more from it.
Yeah, I know, and I think it's a testament to like someone like Mike really working so hard and like being able to be a sponge in the industry is you can tell he knows so much. So I think it's good for our listeners to hear someone with like his level of expertise and knowledge like really diving into the work they're doing.
No, yeah, absolutely. So big thank you to Mike for joining us, and we'll see you guys next week.
Yeah, see you guys next week or 2 weeks. See you
Oh
guys in
yeah.
2 weeks.